If someone asked me what 27 years of marriage looked like, I would have shown them our old photo albums. Now, I'd show them one sentence. Oh, he's just an old friend. Those 6 words erased nearly 3 decades of my life in front of a room full of strangers. My name is Daniel Brooks. I'm 68 years old. And until that evening, I believed my wife, Linda, and I had survived everything life could throw at us. We survived unpaid bills. We survived losing our first home. We survived the death of our baby's son. We survived years of working double shifts just to keep food on the table. Or at least, I thought we had survived together. The invitation came from Linda's college reunion. She seemed unusually excited. "Come with me," she smiled. "It'll be fun." I hadn't seen her that happy in years. So I rented a tuxedo, bought her favorite white roses, even polished the old wedding ring I'd worn every day since 1999. I wanted her to feel proud walking beside me. The ballroom was beautiful. Soft music, crystal chandeliers, people laughing as they recognized faces they hadn't seen in decades. Linda suddenly became someone different. Her posture changed. Her smile grew brighter. She laughed louder than I'd heard in years. Then an elegant man walked toward us. Gray hair, expensive suit, confident smile. Linda's eyes widened. "Michael." She hugged him a little longer than I expected. He looked at me politely. "And who is this gentleman?" I waited for the words every husband expects. "My husband." Instead, Linda smiled awkwardly. "Oh, Daniel." She laughed softly. "He's just an old friend." For a second, I honestly believed I'd misheard her. The room kept moving. People kept talking. But everything around me suddenly sounded far away. 27 years. Reduced to an old friend. And what happened only a few minutes later made those words hurt even more. Daniel stood frozen with the bouquet of white roses still in his hand. Michael smiled politely and extended his hand. "It's nice to meet you, Daniel." Daniel forced himself to shake it. "You too." Linda slipped naturally into conversation with Michael, as if no interruption had happened. "Can you believe it's been 40 years?" she laughed. Michael shook his head. "You haven't changed at all." Daniel looked at his wife. 27 years together. Yet at that moment, he felt like the stranger standing between 2 old friends. One of Linda's former classmates joined them. "Linda, are you married?" Daniel instinctively looked toward his wife, expecting her to correct the awkward introduction. Instead, she hesitated. "Well," she smiled carefully. "It's complicated." Daniel felt something twist inside his chest. Complicated? They had celebrated their 27th anniversary just 3 months earlier. Their wedding photos still hung in the hallway. Their names were on the same mortgage. Their grandchildren called them Grandma and Grandpa. What exactly was complicated? The conversation drifted away from him. Michael began telling stories from their college years. Linda laughed so hard that tears filled her eyes. Daniel couldn't remember the last time she had laughed like that at home. He quietly stepped toward the refreshment table. A waiter offered him sparkling water. "Everything all right, sir?" Daniel smiled politely. "Of course," but his hands were trembling. Across the room, Linda and Michael continued talking. Every few minutes, someone else walked over. Daniel noticed something strange. Each time someone asked about her life, Linda avoided mentioning him. She spoke about her career, her travels, her volunteer work, even their children. But never once did she say the words, "my husband." At first, Daniel wondered if he was imagining it. Then he heard it again. One woman smiled warmly. "So, did you ever marry?" Linda looked briefly toward Daniel. Only for a second. Then she answered quietly, "No, life just took a different path." Daniel nearly dropped his glass. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. He wasn't invisible. He was standing less than 20 feet away. She knew he could hear every word. And still, she erased him, not just from one introduction, from her entire life. Daniel slowly walked onto the balcony outside the ballroom. The cool night air hit his face. For the first time in years, he felt completely alone. A minute later, the balcony door opened behind him. Footsteps approached. Daniel expected Linda. Instead, it was Michael. And the first thing Michael said made Daniel realize he wasn't the only one who had been confused that evening. "So," Michael said carefully, If you're really just an old friend, why are you wearing a wedding ring with Linda's initials engraved inside it? Daniel instinctively closed his hand around his wedding ring. For a long moment, he simply stared at Michael. Then he allowed a tired sigh. Because Linda is my wife. Michael blinked. I'm sorry, what? We've been married for 27 years. Silence. The music from the ballroom drifted faintly onto the balcony, but neither man spoke. Finally, Michael shook his head. No, that's impossible. Daniel frowned. Why would you say that? Michael looked genuinely unsettled. Because Linda told me she never married. Daniel felt the words hit harder than he expected. She told you that? Michael nodded slowly. We reconnected online about 8 months ago. Daniel's stomach tightened. She found me through the alumni page. At first, we exchanged a few messages. Then we started talking every week. Every week. Daniel had no idea. Michael continued. She said life got busy after college. She focused on work, helped raise her nieces and nephews, and never found the right person. Daniel stared at the city lights beyond the balcony. Everything suddenly made sense. The evenings Linda spent smiling at her phone. The quick way she turned the screen over whenever he walked into the room. The late-night messages she called book club discussions. The sudden interest in old photographs from college. He had never questioned any of it. Not because he was naive, because he trusted her. Trust had always been the strongest part of their marriage. Or so he believed. I'm sorry, Michael said quietly. I honestly thought you were an old family friend. Daniel managed a faint smile. So did I, apparently. Neither man laughed. Michael looked back toward the ballroom. I need to ask her what's going on. Daniel gently stopped him. No. Michael looked confused. Why not? Because I don't want another performance. Daniel's voice remained calm, but years of quiet disappointment hid beneath it. If she wanted me to know the truth, she would have told me herself. Just then, the balcony door opened again. Linda stepped outside. There you both are, she said with an easy smile. But the smile disappeared the moment she saw their faces. What's wrong? Michael looked directly at her. Linda, his voice was steady. Why did you tell me you'd never been married? The color drained from Linda's face. She looked from Michael to Daniel. For several long seconds, she said nothing. Then she whispered the words Daniel never imagined hearing. I didn't think the truth mattered anymore. Daniel felt something inside him quietly break. Not with anger, not with shouting, but with the painful realization that, somewhere along the way, the life he had spent 27 years protecting had become something his own wife wanted to hide. He looked into Linda's eyes. I think, he said softly, it's time you told me exactly when our marriage stopped matching. Linda opened her mouth to answer. But before she could say a single word, someone inside the ballroom picked up the microphone and called her name in front of everyone. Linda froze. Her eyes darted toward the ballroom as applause erupted inside. Ladies and gentlemen, the MC announced through the speakers. Before we continue tonight's celebration, we'd like to invite one of our most accomplished alumni to say a few words. More applause, and please welcome Linda Brooks. Daniel looked at her. For 27 years, he had watched her overcome fear, build a career, raise 2 children, and comfort grieving neighbors. He had always been the first person cheering her on. Tonight, he wasn't sure who she was anymore. Linda swallowed hard. I have to go. Daniel stepped aside without saying a word. She walked back into the ballroom. Michael remained on the balcony, clearly uncomfortable. I'm sorry, he said quietly. If I'd known. Daniel shook his head. This isn't your fault. Inside, Linda took the microphone. The room fell silent. She smiled the same polished smile Daniel had seen at charity dinners and company events. Thank you, she began. It's wonderful to see so many familiar faces after all these years. The audience laughed as she shared stories from college. Professors, late-night study sessions, old pranks, dreams they once had. For a few minutes, she looked completely at ease. Then someone from the audience called out with a grin. So, Linda, did life turn out the way you imagined? The room chuckled. Linda hesitated. Daniel watched from the doorway. This was it. One sentence. One chance. She could simply say, I built a beautiful family. She could point toward him. She could tell the truth. Instead, she smiled faintly. I've had a very independent life. A ripple of approving laughter spread through the room. Daniel lowered his eyes. Independent. The word echoed in his mind. Independent from whom? The man who worked night shifts so she could finish graduate school? The husband who sold his vintage motorcycle to pay their daughter's college tuition? The father who sat beside her hospital bed every single day after her surgery? The man who held her hand through every funeral, every setback, every sleepless night? Was that the life she now called independent? The applause grew louder as Linda finished her speech. Daniel quietly placed the bouquet of white roses on a nearby table. He had bought them that morning because they were her favorite. Now, they felt like flowers meant for a stranger. Without saying goodbye to anyone, he picked up his coat and walked toward the exit. Outside, the cool evening air wrapped around him. He reached his car, unlocked the driver's door, and sat behind the wheel. For several minutes, he didn't start the engine. He simply stared at his reflection in the windshield. The face looking back at him seemed older than it had that morning. Not because of age, because of heartbreak. A sudden knock on the passenger window startled him. Daniel looked up. It was Michael. He held something in his hand. A folded envelope. "I think you should have this," Michael said quietly. Daniel frowned. "What is it?" Michael looked back toward the ballroom before answering. "Linda mailed this to me 3 months ago." Daniel accepted the envelope. On the front, in Linda's unmistakable handwriting, were 4 words that made his hands begin to shake. "The life I deserve." Daniel slowly looked back at the ballroom. For the first time that night, he wasn't sure he wanted to know what was inside. Daniel stared at the envelope for several long seconds. The handwriting was unmistakable. Every birthday card, every anniversary note, every grocery list she'd ever left on the kitchen counter. It was Linda's. Michael kept his distance. "I never opened it," he said quietly. Daniel looked up. "You didn't?" Michael shook his head. "It arrived unexpectedly. By then, I felt something wasn't right. I thought, if she had something important to say, she'd eventually say it herself." Daniel gave a slow nod. "You did the right thing." He carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a single folded letter. No greeting, no date, just Linda's handwriting. He began to read. "Sometimes I wonder what my life would have looked like if I had been brave enough to choose differently." Daniel's chest tightened. "I don't regret being a mother. I don't regret building a home. But somewhere along the way, I stopped recognizing the woman in the mirror." He continued reading. "Everyone thinks I have the perfect marriage. The truth is, I've spent years wondering who I might have become if I hadn't settled for the safe choice." Daniel stopped. His hands trembled. Safe choice. Was that all he had been? Not the man who stayed awake beside her after every surgery. Not the husband who worked overtime so she could finish her degree. Not the father who missed promotions because he refused to miss his children's school events. Just the safe choice. He forced himself to finish the letter. "Maybe this reunion is my chance to remember the girl I used to be. Maybe, just for one evening, I want people to see me before they see the life I've built." I don't know whether that's selfish or honest anymore. The letter ended there. No signature, no explanation, only silence. Daniel folded it carefully and slid it back into the envelope. He wasn't angry. Not yet. He was grieving. Grieving a marriage that, until tonight, he thought both of them had been living. Michael spoke softly. "For what it's worth." Daniel looked at him. "She never talked about loving someone else." Daniel nodded. "I believe you." Michael hesitated before adding, "But she talked a lot about feeling invisible." Daniel closed his eyes. Invisible. The irony almost made him laugh. Tonight, she had made him invisible instead. After a long silence, Daniel started the car. "Are you going home?" Michael asked. "Yes." "Aren't you going to wait for Linda?" Daniel rested both hands on the steering wheel. "For 27 years," he said quietly, "I've waited for her to notice everything I did." He looked toward the ballroom one last time. "Tonight, I'm going to let her notice I'm gone." He drove away without looking back. 40 minutes later, Linda walked out of the hotel, smiling as she searched the parking lot. Her smile faded. Daniel's car was gone. She reached into her purse for her phone. There was no missed call, no angry message, no accusation, only one short text sent 12 minutes earlier. "Take your time. I think we both need it." Linda read it twice, then 3 times. For the first time that evening, she realized the quiet man she had taken for granted had stopped chasing after her, and that frightened her far more than any argument ever could. Part 6. Linda arrived home just after midnight. The house was dark. For 27 years, no matter how late she came home, Daniel always left the porch light on. Tonight it was off. She unlocked the front door quietly. Daniel? No answer. She found him sitting alone on the back porch. He wasn't watching television. He wasn't reading. He was simply looking up at the stars with a blanket over his shoulders. The same place where they had spent countless summer evenings talking about their dreams. Linda stepped outside. It's getting cold. Daniel nodded without looking at her. It is. She waited for him to ask where she'd been. He didn't. She waited for him to raise his voice. He didn't. The silence was far worse. Finally, she sat down in the chair beside him. I'm sorry. Daniel spoke before she could continue. Sorry for what? Linda hesitated. For everything that happened tonight. Daniel turned to face her for the first time. I need you to be specific. His voice wasn't angry. It was calm. Almost too calm. Were you sorry when you introduced me as an old friend? She lowered her eyes. Yes. Were you sorry when you told people you had never married? A tear rolled down her cheek. Yes. Were you sorry when you wrote that letter saying I was the safe choice? Linda's head snapped up. You read it. Daniel slowly held up the folded envelope. Michael gave it to me. Her face turned pale. I never meant for you to see that. Daniel gave a sad smile. I know. That's what hurts. The words landed like a stone between them. Linda covered her face with both hands. I wasn't trying to erase you. Daniel looked at her quietly. Then tell me what you were trying to do. She took a long, shaky breath. I was trying to remember who I used to be. Daniel listened without interrupting. When we got married, I had so many dreams. I wanted to travel. I wanted to write a book. I wanted to teach overseas. She wiped away another tear. Then life happened. The mortgage. The kids. Your long work hours. My career. My mother's illness. 1 year became 5. 5 became 20. I looked in the mirror one day and realized I couldn't remember the last time anyone asked me who I wanted to be. Daniel nodded slowly. I understand that. Linda looked surprised. You do. Ido. He leaned back in his chair. But none of that explains why you erased me. Silence. For nearly a minute, Linda couldn't answer. Then she whispered the truth. Because if I admitted I had a husband, Linda couldn't answer. She simply lowered her head. The silence between them stretched so long that the sound of crickets became louder than their breathing. Daniel stood up slowly. He wasn't angry. He wasn't shouting. He just looked tired. Thank you, he said quietly. Linda looked up in confusion. For what? For finally telling me the truth. She reached for him again. Daniel, please don't walk away. He gave her a gentle smile. I'm not walking away because you made a mistake. His eyes filled with tears. I'm walking away because you made a choice. There is a difference. Linda felt her heart sink. I can fix this. Daniel shook his head. You don't fix 27 years with one apology. He walked inside the house. Linda followed him. She found him opening the old cedar chest at the foot of their bed. Inside were dozens of photo albums, birthday cards, children's drawings, hospital bracelets from the births of their son and daughter, the dried white rose from their wedding day. Daniel picked up the first photo album. It was their honeymoon. He smiled at a picture of Linda laughing on a rainy beach. You remember this day? Linda nodded through tears. You insisted we dance in the rain. Daniel smiled faintly. You said it was the happiest day of your life. He closed the album. I've spent years believing those memories belonged to both of us. He placed it back into the chest. Tonight, I realized I've been protecting a story that only one of us was still living. Linda began crying harder. That's not true. It is. He looked around their bedroom. Every wall held a piece of their history. Wedding photographs, family vacations, Christmas mornings, grandchildren blowing out birthday candles. So tell me something, Daniel said softly. If someone walked into this room tomorrow and asked whose life this was, would you finally say it was ours? Linda burst into tears. Yes, but only after someone asked. Daniel replied. I shouldn't have to wait for a question. Those words cut deeper than anything he could have shouted. He walked into his small home office. A few minutes later, he returned carrying a simple overnight bag. Linda stared at it. "What are you doing?" "I'm going to stay with my brother for a few days." Her face drained of color. "No, I need time. Daniel, please." For the first time in 27 years, he said gently, "I'm choosing what's healthy for me." She grabbed his arm. "I love you." Daniel looked into her eyes. "I believe you." She looked relieved for a split second. Then he finished his sentence. "But love that is embarrassed to tell the truth doesn't feel safe anymore." He kissed her forehead, the same way he had every night before going to bed. Only this time, it felt like goodbye. As he reached the front door, Linda called after him. "Will you come back?" Daniel rested his hand on the doorknob. Without turning around, he answered quietly, "I honestly don't know." The door closed. The house became unbearably silent. Linda stood alone in the living room. For the first time since they had married, the home felt like nothing more than a building. She looked at the family photos covering the walls. Every smile, every celebration, every memory. And suddenly she understood something she had refused to see for years. She had spent one evening pretending Daniel wasn't her husband. Now she was about to discover what life actually felt like without him. The next morning, the house felt unfamiliar. Not because anything had changed, but because Daniel wasn't there. No smell of fresh coffee drifted through the kitchen. No old jazz music played softly from the living room. No newspaper lay folded neatly on the dining table. For years, Linda had barely noticed those little routines. Now the silence made every missing habit impossible to ignore. She walked into the kitchen and automatically reached for 2 coffee mugs. Then she stopped. Only one was needed. She slowly put the second mug back into the cabinet. The sound echoed through the empty house. Hours passed. She tried reading. She couldn't focus. She turned on the television. The voices only made the silence feel louder. Finally, she wandered into Daniel's workshop in the garage. It had always been his favorite place. A simple wooden workbench stood beneath the window. His tools were arranged with perfect care. Every screwdriver, every paintbrush, every tiny box of screws had its place. On the wall hung a framed piece of paper she had never really looked at before. It was a handwritten list. At the top, Daniel had written, "Things worth building slowly." Underneath were only 5 words. A family, a reputation, a friendship, a garden, a marriage. Linda stared at the last word until her vision blurred. She remembered teasing him years ago. "You actually framed your own handwriting?" Daniel had laughed. "So I never forget what takes the longest to build and the shortest time to destroy." Back then, she had rolled her eyes. Today, the sentence felt like a mirror. She sat down in his chair. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to cry without trying to justify anything. No excuses. No blaming work. No blaming motherhood. No blaming missed dreams. Just grief. That afternoon, their daughter, Emily, stopped by unexpectedly. The moment she walked inside, she frowned. "Mom, where's Dad?" Linda forced a smile. "He's staying with Uncle Robert for a few days." Emily looked surprised. "Why?" Linda hesitated. "We had a disagreement." Emily studied her mother's face. "You've been crying." Linda couldn't hide it anymore. She quietly told her everything. The reunion, the introduction, the speech, the letter, every painful detail. When she finished, Emily sat in complete silence. Finally, she spoke. "Mom." Her voice was gentle but firm. "Do you know what my earliest memory is?" Linda shook her head. Emily smiled sadly. "I was 5 years old. There was a thunderstorm. I was terrified. I remember waking up and seeing Dad carrying you because you had fallen asleep on the couch. He could have woken you. He could have asked you to walk. But instead, he carried you upstairs like you weighed nothing." Emily looked directly into her mother's eyes. "I remember thinking, that's what love looks like." A tear rolled down Linda's cheek. Emily continued, "I've spent my whole life looking for someone who would love me the way Dad loved you." She paused. "And last night, you told the world he was just an old friend." Those words broke something inside Linda that no apology could repair. For the first time, she wasn't seeing the reunion through her own regrets. She was seeing it through the eyes of the people who had admired their marriage. And she realized she hadn't only hurt Daniel. She had shattered the example of love their children had believed in. That evening, Linda picked up her phone. She stared at Daniel's contact for nearly a minute before pressing call. It rang once, twice, 3 times. Then, the call went to voicemail. Linda stared at the voicemail prompt. For a moment, she considered hanging up. What could she possibly say that would undo the damage? Nothing. She took a shaky breath and began speaking. Daniel, her voice cracked immediately. I know you may not want to hear from me right now, and I understand why. She wiped away her tears. I've replayed last night in my mind 100 times. Not because I'm trying to defend myself, but because I'm finally seeing it through your eyes. She paused. I didn't just embarrass you. I denied the man who stood beside me through every chapter of my life. I erased the person who never once erased me. Her voice grew softer. You deserve to be introduced as the greatest blessing of my life. Instead, I treated you like a footnote. I'm so deeply sorry. She ended the message without asking him to come home, without asking for forgiveness. She knew she hadn't earned either. Across town, Daniel was sitting on his brother Robert's back porch. Robert handed him a cup of coffee. You don't have to listen to it. Daniel looked at his phone. I know, but I should. He pressed play. Linda's trembling voice filled the quiet morning air. When it ended, Daniel didn't speak. He simply set the phone on the table. Robert waited. So, Daniel stared across the yard where 2 young boys were throwing a baseball with their father. You know what hurts the most? Robert shook his head. It wasn't being called an old friend. Robert looked surprised. It wasn't. Daniel slowly shook his head. No, what hurts is realizing she thought our life together wasn't something worth being proud of. His brother remained silent. Daniel continued. I've never cared about fancy titles. I never needed applause. But I always believed that if someone asked who I was, she would smile and say, that's my husband. His eyes filled with tears. With pride, Robert placed a hand on his shoulder. You still love her. Daniel smiled sadly. Edo. But love isn't the question anymore. Robert frowned. What is? Daniel looked toward the sky. Trust. Love can survive disappointment. But trust. He took a slow breath. Trust survives truth. And last night, the truth disappeared. That afternoon, Daniel drove to a small lake he and Linda used to visit every anniversary. He sat alone on the old wooden bench overlooking the water. An elderly groundskeeper recognized him. Haven't seen you two in a while. Daniel smiled politely. It's just me today. The old man nodded. Then he said something so simple that Daniel couldn't stop thinking about it. You know, I've watched couples come here for 30 years. The happiest ones aren't the people who never make mistakes. They're the people who never make each other feel like a mistake. Daniel closed his eyes. Those words settled deep in his heart. As the sun began to set, he reached into his pocket and took out his wedding ring. He slowly turned it between his fingers. For 27 years, he had never taken it off. Not once. He stared at it for a long time. Then, very carefully, he slipped it off his finger. At that exact moment, miles away, Linda pulled into their driveway. Waiting on the front porch was someone she never expected to see, Daniel's 90-year-old mother. And a look on her face told Linda she already knew everything. Linda stepped out of her car slowly. Daniel's mother, Eleanor, was sitting in the old porch swing with her hands folded in her lap. At 90 years old, her movements had become slow, but her eyes were still as sharp as ever. Mrs. Brooks, Linda whispered. Eleanor looked up. You can still call me Mom. Those words only made Linda feel worse. She climbed the porch steps and sat quietly beside her. For a long moment, neither woman spoke. Finally, Eleanor broke the silence. Daniel called me. Linda looked down. I figured. He didn't tell me everything. Eleanor said. He only said, Mom, I think I lost something I can't replace. Linda covered her mouth as fresh tears filled her eyes. I never wanted to hurt him. Eleanor nodded gently. I believe you, but intentions don't erase consequences. Linda wiped her eyes. I know. Eleanor looked toward the front yard where Daniel had planted a young maple tree 20 years earlier. When Daniel was 12 years old, His father forgot our wedding anniversary. Linda listened quietly. I wasn't upset because he forgot the date. I was upset because for one day, I felt invisible. She smiled sadly. Your father-in-law spent the next month trying to make it up to me. He bought flowers. He cooked dinner. He even wrote me letters. Linda asked softly, "Did it work?" Eleanor shook her head. Not at first. Do you know what finally healed us? Linda looked at her. He stopped trying to erase his mistake. He simply acknowledged it every single day through his actions. She reached over and gently took Linda's hand. An apology is spoken once, but repentance is lived. Linda felt those words settle deep inside her. She realized she had spent the last 2 days hoping for one conversation to fix everything. There wasn't going to be one conversation. Trust wasn't rebuilt with promises. It was rebuilt with consistency. Eleanor stood carefully with the help of her cane. Daniel has always loved deeply. She smiled through moist eyes. But people who love deeply also bleed deeply. Before leaving, she turned back one last time. If he chooses to come home, welcome him with honesty. And if he doesn't, honor him with the same honesty. After Eleanor drove away, Linda walked back into the house. She wandered from room to room until she reached the hallway. The family photographs were still hanging on the wall. She stopped in front of one taken on their 25th anniversary. Daniel had his arm around her shoulders. Both of them were laughing. On the bottom of the frame, Daniel had written, "Still choosing you." Linda burst into tears. She suddenly realized something she had never noticed before. For 27 years, Daniel had never once stopped choosing her. Even on the difficult days, even when life became ordinary, even when dreams changed, he had kept choosing her. The only person who had stopped choosing was her. That evening, she sat at the kitchen table with a blank sheet of paper. Not a text message, not an email, a handwritten letter. If she was going to ask for another chance, it had to begin with the one thing she had denied him, the truth. She picked up her pen and slowly wrote the first line. To my husband. 3 days passed. Linda never called again. She never sent another text. She remembered what Eleanor had said. An apology is spoken once. Repentance is lived. So she waited, not because she had given up, but because for the first time in years, she was respecting Daniel's need for space instead of asking him to comfort her guilt. On the 4th morning, there was a knock at the front door. Linda's heart raced. She hurried across the hallway. It wasn't Daniel. It was Robert. He held a small envelope. He asked me to bring you this. Linda accepted it with trembling hands. How is he? Robert smiled sadly. He's breathing. Then he quietly walked away. Linda closed the door and opened the envelope. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper. It wasn't a love letter. It wasn't divorce papers. It was only one page. In Daniel's careful handwriting. Linda, I've read your voicemail more times than you'll ever know. I believe every word of your apology. This isn't about whether you're sorry. I know you are. This is about something much harder. For 27 years, whenever someone asked who you were, I proudly answered, she's my wife. Not because marriage made you valuable, but because I was grateful you had chosen to share your life with me. Last Saturday, I realized something I never expected. You were trying to remember who you were before me. I understand that. What I don't understand is why remembering yourself required forgetting me. I've spent days asking myself one question. Was our marriage real? I finally realized the answer is yes. Every birthday, every sleepless night with sick children, every road trip, every Christmas morning, every laugh, every tear, it was all real. You didn't erase our past. You only denied it for one evening. But sometimes, one evening is enough to reveal a truth that's been quietly growing for years. The hardest part isn't forgiving you. I forgave you the night I left. The hardest part is believing that the next time someone asks who I am, you won't hesitate. Not because you're afraid of losing me, but because you're proud I was there. I'm coming home tomorrow. Not because everything is fixed, because some promises deserve one honest conversation before they're judged forever. Daniel. By the time Linda finished reading, the paper was soaked with tears. She didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She understood exactly what Daniel meant. He wasn't promising reconciliation. He was offering clarity, one final chance to tell the truth. The next evening, just before sunset, a familiar car slowly turned into the driveway. Linda watched from the front window. Daniel stepped out, holding the same overnight bag. He looked older than he had 4 days earlier, but there was still kindness in his eyes. He walked toward the front porch. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Finally, Daniel looked at her and asked quietly, "Before we say anything else, if someone knocked on this door right now and asked who I am, what would you tell them?" Linda knew this was the moment that would define the rest of their lives. There would be no rehearsed speech, no excuses, only the truth. Part 12. Linda looked into Daniel's eyes. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, before she could answer, there was an unexpected knock at the front door. They both turned. Linda slowly opened it. Standing outside was her next-door neighbor, Mrs. Harper, holding a casserole dish. She smiled warmly. "Oh, Daniel, you're back." Then she looked at Linda with a friendly grin. "I was just asking my husband yesterday if your old friend had come home yet." Linda froze. Daniel remained silent. This was the moment. The moment she could quietly let the misunderstanding continue. Or tell the truth. Linda took a slow breath. Then she smiled, not out of politeness, but with quiet certainty. "No." She gently reached for Daniel's hand. "He's not my old friend." Mrs. Harper looked confused. Linda's eyes filled with tears. "This man is my husband, my best friend, the father of our children, the grandfather of our grandchildren, and the greatest blessing God ever trusted me with." Her voice trembled. "I was ashamed of my own regrets, and I made the terrible mistake of acting as though they were his fault." She looked at Daniel. "I'm done rewriting our history. I'm proud of every year we've lived together." Mrs. Harper quietly smiled. "I'll leave you two alone." She placed the casserole on the porch and walked away. The front door closed. Silence filled the house again. Daniel looked at Linda. "This is the first time," he whispered, "that introducing me felt effortless." Linda nodded through tears. "Because this time, I wasn't protecting my pride. I was protecting the truth." Daniel stood quietly for several seconds. Then he reached into his coat pocket. He took out the wedding ring he had removed at the lake. He looked at it for a long time. "I almost left this there." Linda's eyes widened. "I know, but then I realized the ring wasn't what failed. We did. And if people can fail, they can also choose to become better." He slowly slipped the ring back onto his finger. Not because the pain had disappeared, but because hope had returned. Linda wrapped her arms around him. For the first time in days, Daniel hugged her back. It wasn't the embrace of a perfect marriage. It was the embrace of two imperfect people choosing honesty over pride. Months later, they attended their granddaughter's school program. A teacher walked over with a clipboard. Smiling, she asked, "And who is this gentleman with you?" Linda didn't hesitate. She slipped her hand into Daniel's. Her smile was calm, proud, certain. "This," she said, "is my husband, Daniel Brooks." Daniel smiled, not because of the title, but because this time, there wasn't even a second of hesitation. Years later, when people asked Daniel the secret to a long marriage, he always gave the same answer. Love isn't measured by how long you've been together. It's measured by whether you're still proud to stand beside each other when someone asks who you are. Moral: real love never needs to rewrite history. It honors every chapter, even the painful ones, because the people who walked through them together deserve to be remembered together.